Welcome, everyone. Welcome. We will begin in just a moment. If you can see and hear me, please drop your name and location in the chat. Oh, thank you. Everyone's already doing that. Great. I see some repeat names, of course, and people from all over the globe. We just love seeing that. I'm going to drop some special links into the chat for you now. All right. So I just have a few quick housekeeping items to go over with you. First off, I'm Michelle. Welcome to Science Fiction Writers Week. We are so happy to have you here for another session, and we're super excited about this session today. Just a few notes before we begin. Your replays. So these can be found on the hub page with all of your other links, slides, any available special offers from our speakers will be on the hub page, and the replays will be available to watch until September 28th. So feel free to watch those as many times as you'd like. After that date, they will be removed and will be housed in ProWriting Academy. Our offer for you for attending Science Fiction Writers Week with us is 40% off ProWriting Aid Premium yearly plans. So if you have been thinking of upgrading, now is a great time to do so. Not only is it a great deal, but it also helps us continue to put on events like these for free, which we really love being able to do for our community. So if you would like to take advantage of that offer, you can find the details for that in the hub as well. And that is also good until September 28th. So be sure to check that out. If you would like to keep the science fiction writing conversation going, we'd love to have you over in our private online writing community. Joining is super simple. You log in using the link provided with your ProWriting Aid account details, and it lets you write in, and then you can find us over in the live event chat talking about the sessions that are happening this week, talking some fun science fiction things, and more. So please join us over there and check out those threads. Reminders for this session: if you have a question for our speaker, please use the Q&A box. As you can see, the chat moves very quickly, and it's hard to keep up with the questions in the chat, but if you put them in the Q&A, we have them all ready to go. So we will hopefully have a nice little chunk of time for questions at the end. So as our speaker is presenting, please feel free to drop them there. If you'd like to chat with other attendees, please feel free. Be sure that the drop-down menu above your text box says everyone. Otherwise, your messages will only come to the hosts. So with that being said, we are ready to begin. Thank you again for joining us. And I am so happy to introduce our speaker. Today we have Eileen Cook here. She is a multi-published award-winning author with her novels appearing in 9 languages. Her books have been optioned for film and TV. She spent most of her teen years wishing she were someone else or somewhere else, which is a great training for a writer. She's an instructor and mentor with the Creative Academy and Simon Fraser University Writers Studio program. Oh, my screen just went away. Hold on, everyone. So sorry. Okay, we're back. Where she loves helping other writers find their unique story to tell. Eileen lives in Vancouver with 2 very naughty dogs, and we are so happy to have her here. Welcome, Eileen.
Thank you so much. I had so much fun actually watching the chat window go by and being like, oh, I visited that place, or I have family there. So it's really exciting to see people from so many different locations. That's incredible. So I'm really excited to be here.
I will just be hanging out in the background and take it away.
All right. I'm really excited to be here. And I think partly because I find the topic of setting really interesting. And I think in a lot of forms of fiction, setting is overlooked. And that almost never happens in science fiction because many of you are in it in part for that world building and the chance to sort of create those brave new worlds. I know there have been some really great workshops on here. There was one earlier today by World Anvil that talked about sort of world building in space. So you'll be able to check that out. And I know there's another one coming up on Thursday as well. So you're going to want to check that out. So What I wanted to do was talk about something in a little bit of a different perspective. So I want to talk about setting as it relates to your character. So to give you some background, my educational background is in counseling and psychology, and I actually worked for 20 years as a therapist, specializing in people with catastrophic injuries or illness. And one of the things that they drive home when you work as a therapist is that it's not what happens to people, it's the story that people tell themselves about what happened. And it's that internal narrative that sort of drives them forward. In fictional terms, what that means is it doesn't necessarily matter what happens to your character, it's the story they tell themselves. And in terms of setting, what I'm going to try and convince you over the next hour that we have together is that it's not the world building that you're doing, it's how your character fits or doesn't fit into that world. So when we talk about space, and by space I mean just actually physical space, not the final frontier, is whether or not we feel comfortable or not comfortable in that space, what we assume about people who are in different types of spaces, how our view about those spaces can change, and it's going to sort of give you, hopefully, some grounding that you can use to make some prompts and some ideas for your story. Now, because I work as a therapist, you'll see that I'm going to give you a lot of questions that I want you to think on. Now, because we only have an hour together, I'm not going to leave you a lot of time to be doing any writing, but I'm hoping that you're going to write down some responses, and I'd love to hear from some of you whether or not those are helpful for you as you go forward. So this is what I was talking about. It's not what happens to the character, it's the story that they tell themselves, and it's going to be the interaction about how people fit into their setting around them. So there's 4 different levels of setting that I'm going to talk about and just sort of give you some insight into. So the world, the community, personal space, and someone's mind. So I just want to give you a brief understanding of each, and then we're going to dig into each one of these. So when I talk about world, I'm talking about the biggest global, universal, in the case of science fiction, that your story is set within. So it may be a dystopian future, it may be a fantasy world. If we're just talking about plain Earth, then that would be the world that we're talking about. It's that largest level. The community is the spaces where your character hangs out. So this is the local canteen, it's where they work. They may have a tiny bit of control over this space, but it's a little bit more limited. It's where they're spending a lot of time. Personal space is exactly what it sounds like. So that is their private space. But I want you to keep in mind that private space has even levels within it. So if you think of your own home, there's your living room where you have a space that you are focused on that you might invite other people into. And then there might be an even more private space. Or if you grew up with siblings, even your room may not have been your space individually, right? So all of that will go into it. And don't worry actually at all, I saw in the question in terms of like, what if you have more than one protagonist? We're going to be talking about each one of these characters and how they intersect with that space. And we'll be giving you hopefully some jumping off parts to go with. Also, when I talk about personal space, I'm going to get into things that are some things you might not think of as setting. So oftentimes some secondary characters or the people around us are a part of that personal space. They make up sort of that backdrop. Clothing is another thing that I sort of talk about in terms of setting, dealing with personal space, because it is a part of how we present ourselves to the world. And then the last sort of personal space that we talk about is actually within our minds. Now, this is all because I come from a therapeutic background. So my interest is always how we see the world, colors, how we interact within that world. So that's where that's coming from. All right. So now let's get into some of these and have some sort of fun with it. Now, when we talk about the world, this is often what we think about most often when we talk about world building. So certainly when people are sort of diving into doing some science fiction writing, this is part of the fun that you have, which is, what is this world look like? Now, the thing to think about in terms of your character's perspective is that this is the world that they inhabit. They pretty much have to live within this world. This isn't usually a chance of something that you can't leave Earth. Some of us may want to, depending what's happening in terms of your own personal corner of it. But we don't, at least at this point, have much of an option to get out of this global situation. Now, it is a little bit smaller in terms of, you can also think of terms of what country, in terms of, our current Earth that we were looking at, and you're going to have to expand that to make sense within your world. But it's the place where you live that you have very little choice about. So here's the fun that starts to come when we start talking about this in terms of character development, right? So what does your character think of the larger world that they live in? So if I use a Star Wars example, because I am of that era and that's what I grew up with, the original 3 movies, is this someone who is on the side of the Empire, or is this someone who is on the side of the rebellion? We all exist within what world we have, and where do we fit into that? Now, where did your character come to that belief about the world? So let's go back to that whole idea of the Empire versus the rebellion. Part of where we get those views is the old nature and nurture thing. It's what we grow up with. So if you grew up as a kid who was the child of one of the generals in the emperor, you would be saying, this is a good thing, because that's everything that you're hearing about. This is the empire is fantastic. The emperor does a great job. Those rebels are horrible, right? You can certainly think in terms of your own politics that you grew up with in your home. There's a period of time where you then may start to question that. So is that something that's going to happen in your story? Is your character, whether that's one or multiple protagonists, having a moment where their perspective of the world that they live in is changing? So I'm going to give just a personal example. I grew up in the US. I now live in Canada. I grew up in the US, and I grew up with a military dad, long-term military family, and everything was, America is the best country in the world. I grew up with that. I had zero doubts of that. I actually assumed the rest of the world thought that. And it wasn't until I actually moved to Canada, and then eventually I lived in Europe for a period of time, that I started to understand that not everybody saw things from the perspective that I had, that the world was a little bit different, right? Is something happened maybe before your story even opens that has changed the perspective of your character? So maybe they were someone who thought that the empire was fantastic, and then before something happened, their family was carted off, right? And now their world is suddenly like, wait a minute, that has changed, right? So what is that shift that has happened that might have changed their belief about the world? Here's some fun things to think about when we get back to, I think it was Neosi who was talking about having multiple different protagonists, are they suddenly maybe meeting people who see different parts of the world? So someone who is saying to them, hey, actually the empire isn't that great, right? It's not. Sorry to tell you that, Chris. All right, so it's not the best. And here's something that you may not be aware of. Did you know that this is happening? So there may be something of the world that your character sees that other characters don't see. And that's where you're going to have some wonderful conflict, because when we don't see the world in the same way, something that I take for granted that is 100% fact and true may not, in fact, be fact and true. This may be part of the arc that you have in your story, right? So your character may be going from someone, and I promise I will have other than Star Wars references, but your character may be going from someone who is the child of a general in the Empire and who is 100%, the Empire is the best in the entire world, galaxy, as case may be, and then maybe shifting and changing that perspective, right? So there's going to be a shift that happens for them. That may be part of it. In most cases, most of us don't have a lot of control over the larger world. Now, depending on your character, especially in science fiction, you may have a character who has that kind of world-changing kinds of situations, but most characters starting off rarely will. All right. I just want to go one level down here. And we're going to talk about community. So when we go from the world, now we're just narrowing down a little bit, right? So we're narrowing down into the places that your character hangs out. So the town that they live in, the neighborhood that they do, the places where they spend time, right? So where do they work? Where do they socialize? Where do they go shopping? Do they any kind of sporting events, right? What are those spaces that they inhabit? Now, this is where you might actually start to have a little bit more control, right? We have some decisions about where we spend our time. And so understanding that the reader is going to make some judgments about your character depending on where they spend their time, right? And what do we assume about them based on where they're spending that time? Now, this is often a place where you're seeing a lot of change over the arc of a story. And by that, what I mean is you have a situation where a character may be starting off in one place and then transporting and going to different places. So again, going back to our favorite here, our Star Wars, Luke starts off on Tatooine, right? This is really the only world that he has ever known, right? And he is going to suddenly, one, get off the farm, which is always a good idea, in my opinion, get off the farm. He's going to go into town. He's going to start going to places like the cantina. He's going to start to expand his world. And then obviously after this point, he's actually going to leave this planet altogether and travel to different places. So that whole idea of a fish out of water, right? But someone is going to go from where they are to a new place. So really fun things to think about under this heading when you think about your character is, where is your character happy and where is your character feeling relaxed versus what spaces do they not feel comfortable or relaxed within. So I pulled here obviously a slide from the cantina scene that happens in that Star Wars movie. And you can look at sort of the differences between how those characters interact within that. So if you look at Luke, when he's coming into that scene, he's looking all around. He's sort of, his mouth is hanging open. He can't quite believe what he's seeing. He feels uncomfortable. He feels out of edge. All of that is happening for him. Then you shoot over and you're looking at Han Solo. He's having a very different experience, right? This is a place where he feels comfortable and relaxed. These are his people, right? And then if you look at Obi-Wan, it's again, even a little bit different. So I want you to think and make yourself a list of what spaces your character hangs out. And are they comfortable in those spaces or are they uncomfortable in those spaces? Are there spaces that are going to change? Are there places where they hang out, but now they're going to go to different places? Are their views of those places going to change? Right? So if you are someone who is very comfortable in this hive of scum and infamy, as Casey so wonderfully put it, does that change by the end of your story? Would Han Solo feel as comfortable in this space once he has become a part of the rebellion? So at one point, he felt very comfortable and at home in a very morally flexible, hanging out kind of socializing place, but that may change. You can certainly think in terms of also your own spaces where you might have hung out, or a place where you spend time when you were a high schooler or when you were younger versus where you would spend time now. Anyone who ever became a parent knows that they might go from that space to like being totally freaked out, being in around a bunch of small kids, and then suddenly finding themselves at home and comfortable in that space. So the biggest thing isn't so much the space, but what does your character think about that? Because the reader is going to be taking a lot from that, right? They're going to be making assumptions about your character, and you can show the changes that your character is going through by showing how they feel comfortable or uncomfortable in a particular space. So that's where we get this idea of showing that character arc. Exactly. I saw in the chat when it goes by that first day of school versus the last day of school. There's been a change in who you are. The setting is the same. The school is the same. I don't know if anyone has ever had the experience of going back to I went back to my high school to do a school presentation. I hadn't been back there in, let's just say, some amount of time. And the school was in so many ways exactly the same. The building was the same, but I was so different that suddenly I remembered the school as being huge and large. Like I remembered the walk between my locker to the cafeteria was miles long. And it really wasn't. So the building didn't shrink. I've changed. My perspective of the world has changed. So thinking about what spaces your character inhabits. You can also have some fun. I love conflict, right? So thinking about, is there a space where someone feels very comfortable? Do you need to take that space away from them? So speaking of burning bridges, if we go here to Star Wars, you have Luke Skywalker. He's in Tatooine. He lives on a moisture farm. You'd think he couldn't wait to get off this farm. He talks a lot about how he wants to have this adventure. But the first time that he's asked, hey, do you want to go do this thing? He's like, I can't. I have to stay here. And that's about fear. When we talk about the idea of the hero's journey and the refusal of the call, when you hear that term, it's the idea that most of us like our space. Certainly during the pandemic, did anyone have a weirdness, or hopefully it wasn't just me, that when the pandemic sort of started to wane and we could go out again, I felt actually sort of anxious outside of my home space because I had become so ingrained with it, right? So do you need to take space away from your character, right? So what happens to Luke Skywalker, of course, is they actually just set his family on fire. It's like a legit burning the bridge behind him. So he has no choice but to now go out into the world. So you may have to launch your character out of a space that they feel comfortable in. Or you may have a character who is ready for adventure, who can't wait to get out and go and explore something and do something. So getting them out of their home spaces may not be as difficult because they're ready to go. And then the real question by the end of your book is it a space that they want to return to? Or is it that, you can't go home again, that the space itself is different and has changed? Someone may have to leave a space in order to grow. So that's part of it. Now we are going to get into some of my favorite stuff to talk about, which is our personal space. So personal space is space that we tend to have much more control about. As I said earlier, it may or may not be completely private. So I have my space one that I have right behind me because I know it shows up in Zoom. So I can guarantee you that space is almost always clean. Now, if you were to go a few feet to the right, you would see possibly some other things that were not as tidy, right? But I certainly can pick it up quickly, right? Because this is my living room, so people come into this space. Where we live and what we do with that space tells us something about that person. This is why people spend so much effort and energy around decor and about wanting that space to reflect who they are. Doesn't mean that it has to necessarily be quote unquote decorated, but we're sending a message. You remember for me, when I was growing up in my culture where I went to school in Michigan, decorating your school locker was one of those most important things that you did at the beginning of the school year, right? You had to make sure you had the right band pictures that were in there, right? So if you were me, you wanted to make sure you had the Cure and the Smiths so that anyone who came by knew that you weren't someone who liked Duran Duran, right? Like you had a very clear thing where you wanted to set a example of who you were by how I decorated that tiny personal little space that was mine. I'll give another reference. I'm going to take off from Star Wars for a chance, and I'm going to go from one of my other favorite shows, which is Firefly, both the movie and the show. But the decision to make Serenity and what that ship looked like versus a sleek spaceship that we often tend to think of if we think of something like a Star Trek, right? Those are both ships, they're both spaceships, and we're making a very distinct difference by how we as the author decorate those ships to talk about the world and about the people who inhabit them. And then we look at terms of even within Firefly, if you look at Inara's quarters versus space that Kaylee occupies, right? It's a very different kind of space. So there is often how we might decorate what I'm going to call our private public space and our private private space. So this is thinking in terms of when I was a therapist, we always decorated and we always wanted to make sure that we didn't have anything too personal in our offices, right? And we wanted the place to look serene. But then there was often things that we might have within our desk, which mine was always a thing of chaos, right? So there would be a very big difference that would happen in that space. Or you might think of someone who might have a really tidy living room, but if you were to open up their bedroom, you might find tons of dishes. You might find all various kinds of things that would make a difference to that. So I haven't forgotten Manson's question, but I'm skipping it for just a moment to kind of go back to this. In terms of writing eco-fiction and eco-fantasy, thinking in terms of what are the spaces that the person may have control over or what they don't have control over and what they can do with that space, right? So even if you say something like an ocean, is this someone who is collecting things within their space of that? What are their options within that? This is where we often see that makeover montage of space as a part of showing a character change. So I'm going to give a nice Earth example, right? So I want you to imagine that we are making a movie. And in this movie, I want to show that the character has been so depressed after a breakup. So we see their apartment. Their apartment is covered in takeout containers. There's laundry draped over the sofa. There's a nice pile of dried and crusty Kleenexes at the foot of the person, right? And we want to show that finally they're like, that's it, that's enough, right? So we suddenly see them like they look around and they are like, I am not this person. And so they suddenly clean that space. They might tear down the picture that belonged to their ex-partner. They might realize, you know, I never liked that freaking sofa, and out it goes out the window because they're making a change. So you can use how the character likes their space or dislikes their space to show that they want to make a shift and a change. You can also have some conflict with this in terms of, is there someone who invades their personal space, who puts that space at risk? Has anyone here gone from living alone to having a partner at any point? And you have this moment where someone says they want to move something into your space, and you're like, that does not go into my space, right? The running joke is some rundown, you know, easy chair type of thing, right? But something where it's like, that's not a thing that I would have in my space. And I now have to negotiate that space with someone else. College roommates versus family is a great example. So doing that kind of, what is that going to look like? Some people, I saw it go by, they have a lot of 6 kids. I would never sleep. They have very little personal space. Like, is there a drawer in the house where you keep your secrets? Is there something that is this little tiny part of your space? How does your character feel about that space? Are they proud of that space? The character. Are they lying? So are they trying to set up a space that looks a certain way, but it actually isn't who they really are? And how can you show that? So is it the person who has the meticulously decorated place, but we see that under their bed, there is something that tells us who they truly are, right? Mounted dead animals would 100% be a deal breaker for me as well, Melina. And you can see that people make judgments, right? I always have a thing whenever I'm dating anyone, if I go to someone's house and I don't see books, I think we're not going to get along. Unless they say they have everything on digital, which I will consider, but I want to see someone's bookcases and what kinds of things that they have on the wall. When they have the singing fish on the wall, I am making some sort of decision about them, as well as it's the total cold and sterile place. So what is the space telling the reader about your character? What do they know about the character because of how that character lives in, decorates, and creates the space? Now I'm going to go with something that might be a little bit risky, but I'm going to ask you to think of secondary characters as something that might be part of setting. And that is because we also sort of judge people by the people that they have around them, right? So if I meet you outside of this session and I say, oh, I want you to meet my friends, and I take you out and I take you to a biker bar where everybody has tattoos on their personal face, and it's loud, it's smoky, you would be like, okay, that's interesting. That is not what I expected about that person, right? You're going to make a decision about me because of those people that I have around me. And now if I took you to someone else's place and I have all my friends were members of the chess club, that's interesting. And again, we're not all one or the other. I don't know if you have this experience, but certainly I have friends from all different sorts of walks of life. And some of them you might be surprised to find I'm friends with, and some that you wouldn't. But what are the universal things that come back? What are the things that sort of tell us something about them? Why does your character hang out with the people they hang out with? Here's a fun and interesting prompt, I think, which is there anyone in your character's life that they are ashamed of? Maybe it's a family member. Maybe it's the person who's gone off to college or university and they are trying to portray themselves as a certain way. And then their parents come up and their parents are telling corny dad jokes, and they're suddenly embarrassed by their parents' car, by what their parents are wearing, and they want to distance themselves from that. That can certainly, again, help us to show character, because we can see that they are ashamed of that person. And then we may be wondering, we may judge them for that. And that again, may be part of their journey, is coming to terms with, and I have a dad who is a goofy dad joke central, right? Is a part of me as much as the friends that I have who might work for NASA. They're very different, but as part of it. So there's that kind of shift between that, right? And so shame may be part of it. Embarrassment may be part of it. You may be collecting people around you because, again, you're trying to portray a particular image. So is your character collecting people because they want to have a certain look to them? Is there something that they want to do that with, right? I saw that the question came in here, like in terms of personal space, can it be a hangout for the community? Yes. Now, if it's a public hangout, so if the personal space is my house and I invite everybody over to it, or I have a clubhouse and I invite all of you guys over to it, that's a personal space. If it is a community center where we all hang out, then that is a community space. So that's maybe that shifts there a little bit. It depends whether or not we're inviting people into that, right? So thinking in terms of what people do we have around them? And this may help Letitia answer the question, what about personal space where people don't have their space? They've had to leave their space. That was the point of the whole story, is they've launched themselves out of the Shire, right? Do you remember that great George Carlin skit where he talks about our stuff? If anyone remembers this, if not, you should look up George Carlin and stuff. But he talks about when you go on vacation, you pack up all of your stuff and you take a small amount of your stuff to take with you on vacation. And then you're on vacation and someone says, oh, well, now we're going to go for a day trip over here. And you have to take a smaller amount of your stuff. So if you have someone who is going on a hero's journey, they may have a small amount of their stuff that they are taking with them. And then I'm interested to know, what is the stuff that they choose to take? What is the thing that they can't live without? Are they someone who is packing their stuffed animal? And they would rather take that than an extra 3 outfits, right? What is the stuff that is important to them? And for the purposes of this discussion, where we're talking about setting, sometimes I think of as other people that we take with us as part of our stuff. Frodo needs Sam on that trip, right? Sam is going to be a part of him that he needs to take with him in order to have that as part of his trip. We do know, just taking a brief aside from a counseling background, that we are impacted by the people around us. So if you hang out with a lot of people who engage in certain hobbies, if you hang out with a lot of people who are active, you're more likely to be a little bit more active. Certainly with mood, if you hang out with people who are positive, it tends to sort of pull up our positivity, right? So again, some fun prompts and things to ask yourself as a part of this is there a group of people that your character used to hang out with, but now they don't fit with those people in the same way anymore? How did those other people view that change, right? So if you were someone, for example, who used to drink really heavily, and then you decide to become sober, oftentimes what you'll see is therapists will talk about the need to maybe look and explore your friend group, because you may not be able to hang out with the same people in the same way because you are now a different person. So can you use the characters around your protagonist, whether that's one protagonist or multiple protagonists, to show that they have changed? They are in fact different. Is there someone, a group of people, or a particular person that your character wants to fit into? And are they trying to change to do that? So this is always the thing where someone has to decide to do something to fit in with the popular crowd, right? Or I always find it interesting when you go to cons or you go to conferences, people are sort of looking for those people who fit in with them. And you'll see people sort of become of that part of that group. All right. So we're still in personal space, but I want to talk a little bit about clothing. It might seem like a strange thing to talk about, but I think clothing is actually a part of our setting. Clothing is one of the first elements that we surround ourselves with. And so I want you to think, even to start off with your own personal wardrobe. So clothing is a prime example of communication. We're trying to send a message oftentimes by what we're wearing. Now, sometimes people will say, well, apparently I'm sending the message that laundry is not a priority to me. But that is a message, right? If you're someone who's like, I don't care what I wear, like I want to be comfortable, that's a message about who you are. In as much as someone else who is wearing a certain clothing to fit in with a particular type of crowd, right? We judge other people oftentimes by what they wear, right? Not necessarily, again, that is based on this idea that, I mean, you may be someone who judges someone whether or not they're wearing designer clothing or not. I'm going to take a guess that a lot of people here are not in that crowd. But you may make a decision if someone is wearing something that you find offensive, or you feel like, oh, they put entirely too much effort. I'm always leery of other women that I meet that have the unbelievable huge amounts of makeup, where I think, what's going on there? And that's probably just my own personal judgment that I have with that, right? Clothing is a great way to identify that you are a part of a group, whether that's a uniform, a sports team, a designer logo, gang colors, right? There are certain things that identify that. You can use clothing, again, to possibly show a shift in your character. So is there a moment where your character needs to put on a uniform? How do they feel about the process of putting that on? Is that dehumanizing, or is it something that they feel really excited about? My best friend growing up became, of all things, a pediatric cardiologist. And she talks about the moment when she was stethoscoped, which is basically where she got her certificate and she got to put on her lab coat that said, you know, Dr. Emerson, that she got her stethoscope. And it felt like, aha, I have arrived in that moment, right? And it felt aspirational and it felt exciting. So how does your character feel in their clothing? Do they get to choose their clothing? Is there a shift with that? Again, you can play with, is there a way that your character dresses when they are out and about? Or is it something that they are wearing when they're only home alone? Clothing tells us so much about that. Does your character have to wear something that they can't stand, that grates on them? I'm thinking here of The Handmaid's Tale, where you had to wear a certain outfit depending on where you fit into society. Is your character putting on clothing that doesn't actually, quote unquote, fit them? And are they going to be outed at some point? Would it add conflict to destroy or damage some lucky piece of item or clothing that someone has? Again, this is often those montage scenes, right? It's the person who goes from one clothing and they sort of change into something else. If you want to look in film is another great example that you can see so much effort is spent by the costumers to show that change. So if you look at how Luke Skywalker looks at the beginning, he's in very nondescript clothing. It's a farmer's outfit, right? And then at the end of that first film, you see that he is in more of what we'd call kind of maybe a soldier's uniform, right? So he is moving to being someone who is an active rebel, not a farmer. If you look at how Katniss looks at the beginning of the Hunger Games and how she appears at the end of those first films, you will see again that there is that shift that happens. Anyone look back at high school pictures and think, oh, sweet Jesus, I wore that outfit out, right? And like, I would not wear the things I wore in high school necessarily because I am a very different person now. So how has your character changed, and space has changed with that, right? So you can have a lot of fun to see how their clothing may change and how that will shift and make a difference to them. All right. The next part of space that we talk about is the mind. So how we perceive the world depends on what's happening often inside of our own mind. And I know whether or not you've been in therapy, I think you have known this experience, right? Which is depending on how your feelings are, what's happening with your clothing, what's happening within your kind of mood impacts how you see things. So you can go to a space that is neutral, like an airport, and you can find that overwhelming and stressful, or you can find it exciting and invigorating. The truth of the matter is, the space itself has not changed. It is strictly the perception of that space. Maybe, I'll give an example. I'm dental phobic. So the instant that I walk into a dentist's office, I am highly attuned to the sounds, that weird, creepy, burnt teeth smell that's in a dentist office mixed with antiseptic, right? And I am on edge the entire time that I'm there. I have a good friend. She has 4 kids. She naps, which I find bizarre. She falls asleep while they're cleaning her teeth. The space isn't different. The space is exactly the same. It is the person's perception on that. This is where I'm getting a little bit psychology, but you need to understand that emotions drive motivation. And in fact, if you look at the root word for emotion, you'll find out it means to move. So emotions are what drive change. And motivation is either a push or a pull. So I'm going to give an example here that's a little bit of a setting example. I worked with Simon Schuster before as one of my publishers. And Simon Schuster is in the Rockefeller Plaza building, if anyone's ever had a chance to be there. And I think I'm going to screw this up, but I'm going to say it's 110 stories. It's a tall building. And there is a rooftop deck at the top of that. If you go up there, you can see all of Manhattan. You can see for days. It's an incredible view. So if I took all of you up there on a field trip and I said to you, I would like you to jump to the next building over. And in fact, there is one corner of the building where the next building is only about 6 feet away. You actually probably could make that jump from one place to the other. Very few people are going to make that jump. Very few sane people are going to make that jump. But I can talk about a pull or a push. So I could say we are now in the publishing Hunger Games, and there is a $1 million book contract on the other side, and all you have to do is jump across and grab it, right? And all of a sudden, some of you might be like, I actually took track in high school, and if I got up a running start, I might be able to make it. And that was what we would call is a pull motivation to make a change. So is your character pulled to change their setting? Are they pulled to go exploring because something looks amazing or looks interesting? I can also do what's called a push motivation. So a push motivation is where I say to you, I have really bad news. This building is on fire. And the fire has already spread to the stairwells. We are up 110 stories, so there's absolutely no way that we're going to be able to get a fire truck ladder up here. It's a super windy day, so the copters aren't going to be able to take us off. So you have to make a choice at this point to risk it and go for it, or to basically burn to death, right? This is what basically happened to Luke Skywalker, as Chris is pointing out. He was pushed from his home. His farm was literally, with his family in it, burnt to the ground. He had to make a push change. He had to make that shift. You may have something in your story where your character is pushed out of their environment in order to do something because they have no choice. Now, you can have both a push and a pull. There can be a little bit of both. So if we look at somebody like Frodo, that was one of the examples that came up, there was a little bit of both. I think Frodo wanted to go adventuring. There was also a push in that if someone didn't return that ring to Mordor, Middle Earth in general was all at risk. So that is both a push and a pull, right? Setting can do that. Our setting can become uncomfortable. Maybe where your character lives, differences between them and their family are going to drive them out of the place that they live. Or perhaps there is something that they want, some brave new world, and they want to go exploring that and they feel pulled to that thing. Setting can create an emotional experience. I was talking to someone who was going through a divorce, and she was talking about the fact that she knew she had to leave when she would drive into her driveway and she would feel her stomach clench and become ill, because that was the moment that she realized, I'm not comfortable in my own home. That was becoming a push. So even though she wanted to leave and she liked the idea of leaving, she was scared, much in the same way Luke Skywalker talked to Big Game about wanting to go to the academy, and talked to Big Game about how he wanted to see the world, see the universe, and have all these adventures. He sort of stopped himself from doing that. So he needed that extra push in order to go with it. So when you are in doubt and you're thinking about why a character is going to make a change, I'm just going to point out to you that people in general, and I say this as a therapist with years of experience, don't easily make change. We are creatures of habit. So things that need to happen tend to be strong emotions. It's a strong pull or it's a strong push that will often drive us to do that. So thinking through, if you're changing settings, what is it that is driving your character from one thing to the next in order to do that? And understanding that their perception changes that. So a quick, and there's no quiz on this, you don't have to worry. There is a counseling theory called rational emotive therapy. And it's by a fellow named Ellis. You don't need to remember that, but you want to maybe remember his idea of A, B, and C. A is the activating event. It's what actually objectively happens. B is our belief about that event. And C is the consequence of that belief. So for example, if you walk into a room and everyone starts laughing, that's the activating event. If your belief about that is they are laughing at me, that will drive your consequence. You may never go back to that event again. You may never want to be with those people again. So you can start playing with what happens to your character, what they believe about that event, and how that drives a consequence that may have them change their setting. I like setting so much, I wrote a whole book about it. And what I'm hoping to convince you, or that I have convinced you in the time that we had together, is that it is more than where your story takes place. It is where your character feels comfortable or uncomfortable, and it will show us how your character has changed by how they fit in that space. They are different people, then how they fit into their space will be different. All right. So I left some time for questions. So I want to see if I made a chance to get through things or if I missed anything. And please feel free to dump extra questions in there if I've missed anything. Hang on, I need to read this one. Someone asked, do you think it's possible to add moral complexity on the story in which the protagonist never always a good person, where they are sometimes sacrificed other victims to save someone else? Even the antagonist wasn't always a bad person. I'm going to go on the big thing that I absolutely love, morally ambiguous people, because I think the truth is almost all of us are. So that complexity is really interesting. And again, thinking about space with that, around where we feel comfortable, where we don't feel comfortable, how that changes in different times. If you've ever had someone see you outside of a space that you expected to, anyone ever as a little kid have a moment where you saw a teacher outside of school and you had that total freak out moment because you didn't realize that they didn't live like in the supply closet, right? It's a shift of that. So changing that can make a big difference. I saw someone say, is the mind maybe the most pivotal? In a lot of ways, there's questions sometimes about what comes first, and therapists will debate this endlessly. What comes first, thinking about something differently or things happening to you? And I think the truth of the matter is that both of those interact with each other. That is, if you've ever had something really stark happen to you, it changes your thought process. If you've ever were betrayed by a best friend, where all of a sudden you now see the world differently, right? But in a lot of cases, if we're trying to drive a change, you have to start thinking about what your perspective is. Are there rules to setting up different spaces is one of the questions. I don't think that there's necessarily rules, and I think there's some great workshops that are coming up, and also the one that was earlier today that talked about the idea of how do you kind of step by step go through the process of world building. So I'm going to kind of defer to the other speakers on that one. Other than for my only rule, and again, coming from my perspective, is thinking always not just, oh, they need to have a bedroom, so I'm going to put a bed, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that. But think in terms of how does this individual person see their space? As a psychologist, how would the mentality of a character that doesn't have a personal object they need, but in the story finds it? So before and after. I think one is just starting in terms of thinking of yourself. There are certain things that I have in my life that gives me comfort. And if I need that object, and in fact, you can think of, there are a lot of stories that are set up with, you need to find the magical ring, you need to find the book, you need to find this thing that belonged to your grandmother, and that will unlock things. It's rarely actually the object itself, right? The power to go home was always Dorothy's, but it's the process that she went through. So what is the meaning that we attach to things? A ring is just a ring until you say to someone, this is a symbol of my love and fidelity. And then when I take off that ring and throw it in your face because I find out that you had an affair, that's a different way of using that perspective. Going back through here, how different can a character's different aspects be and still be a cohesive, healthy person? Yes, I mean, we can go all the way to the, as you talked about, the dissociative disorder, but most of us are different with different people. And in fact, that's sometimes where we can sometimes be uncomfortable when we have people who know us in one world suddenly show up in a different part of those worlds. We feel uncomfortable with that, in part because we may allow different vulnerabilities in one space than in another. So someone who in your work life suddenly shows up in your writing group and you're like, I don't know how I feel about that person reading my pages, makes a very big difference. Someone asked, any psychology book recommendation for character building? I'm going to give two. So the first is purely self-serving. I wrote a book called Build Better Characters, where I take psychology theories and I show how you can use them in fiction, because that's what I'm interested in. But you don't have to buy my book. The other thing that I would say is your library is the best resource you can have. Is go into your library and look for self-help books on any issue that your character is dealing with. And I guarantee you the self-help section is huge. Does your character love too much, love too little? Does your character have just become a new parent? Is your character dealing with post-traumatic stress disorder? Is your character dealing with any of those things? Then any of those things there's a self-help book, which will have examples in it, and it will have step-by-step about how someone can move through that, which will be really useful. All right, we got a couple minutes left. I always mention using a flashlight to show the environment. How much environment should we let the reader imagine? I think readers can imagine a lot when we give people just a little bit to see that thing, because again, we will judge people by those little snippets of space. So hopefully it is that idea of honing into what those details are. So it's less of an importance that you know that I have a navy blue sofa, and probably much more of a character showing detail for you to have a moment where someone scans over floor to ceiling bookcases. That tells a lot more about me. So thinking about if you're going to point your flashlight in some part of the environment, what's the part that's going to give you the biggest bang for the buck? I think we're out of time, so you can find out more about me. Michelle put it in there. There's my website. And if I didn't answer a question, feel free to reach out to me and I will find a time to answer it for you.
Thank you so much, Eileen. This was great. There's been so much good chatter in the chat and great feedback already. So I know that they've just taken so much away from your session today, and we're just so grateful to have you here.
Thank you to Pro Writing Aid. I love you guys.
All right, everyone. Thanks for attending. We'll have the replay and all of Eileen's links and her slides up on the hub by tomorrow morning. So check back there to see those, and we'll see you at the next session. Bye, everyone.